Everybody's Protest Novel. From Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, that cornerstone of American social protest fiction, St. Clair, the kindly master, remarks to his coldly disapproving Yankee cousin, Miss Ophelia, that, so far as he is able to tell, the blacks have been turned over to the devil for the benefit of the whites in this world. However, he adds thoughtfully, it may turn out in the next. Miss Ophelia's reaction is, at least, vehemently right-minded. "This is perfectly horrible," she exclaims. "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves." Miss Ophelia, as we may suppose, was speaking for the author. Her exclamation is the moral, neatly framed, and incontestable like those improving mottos sometimes found hanging on the walls of furnished rooms. And like those mottos, before which one invariably flinches, recognizing an insupportable, almost an indecent glibness, she and St. Clair are terribly in earnest. Neither of them questions the medieval morality from which their dialogue springs. Black, white, the devil, the next world, posing its alternatives between heaven and the flames, were realities for them as, of course, they were for their creator. They spurned and were terrified of the darkness, striving mightily for the light. And considered from this aspect, Miss Ophelia's exclamation, like Mrs. Stowe's novel, achieves a bright, almost lurid significance, like the light from a fire which consumes a witch. This is the more striking as one considers the novels of Negro oppression written in our own, more enlightened day, all of which say only, "This is perfectly horrible. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves." Let us ignore, for the moment, those novels of oppression written by Negroes, which add only a raging, near paranoid postscript to this statement, and actually reinforce, as I hope to make clear later, the principles which activate the oppression they decry. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very bad novel, having, in its self-righteous, virtuous sentimentality, much in common with Little Women. Sentimentality, the ostentatious parading of excessive and spurious emotion, is the mark of dishonesty, the inability to feel. The wet eyes of the sentimentalist betray his aversion to experience, his fear of life, his arid heart, and it is always, therefore, the signal of secret and violent inhumanity, the mask of cruelty. Uncle Tom's Cabin, like its multitudinous, hard-boiled descendants, is a catalog of violence. This is explained by the nature of Mrs. Stowe's subject matter. Her laudable determination to flinch from nothing in presenting the complete picture. An explanation which falters only if we pause to ask whether or not her picture is indeed complete. And what constriction or failure of perception forced her to so depend on the description of brutality, unmotivated, senseless, and to leave unanswered and unnoticed the only important question, what it was, after all, that moved her people to such deeds. But this, let us say, was beyond Mrs. Stowe's powers. She was not so much a novelist as an impassioned pamphleteer. Her book was not intended to do anything more than prove that slavery was wrong, was, in fact, perfectly horrible. This makes material for a pamphlet, but it is hardly enough for a novel. And the only question left to ask is why we are bound still within the same constriction. How is it that we are so loath to make a further journey than that made by Mrs. Stowe, to discover and reveal something a little closer to the truth? But that battered word, truth, Having made its appearance here, confronts one immediately with a series of riddles and has, moreover, since so many gospels are preached, the unfortunate tendency to make one belligerent. Let us say, then, that truth, as used here, is meant to imply a devotion to the human being, his freedom and fulfillment, freedom which cannot be legislated, fulfillment which cannot be charted. This is the prime concern, the frame of reference. It is not to be confused with a devotion to humanity, which is too easily equated with a devotion to a cause. And causes, as we know, are notoriously bloodthirsty. We have, as it seems to me, in the most mechanical and interlocking of civilizations, attempted to lock this creature down to the status of a time-saving invention. He is not, after all, merely a member of a society or a group, or a deplorable conundrum to be explained by science. He is, in how old-fashioned the word sounds, something more than that, something resolutely indefinable, unpredictable. In overlooking, denying, evading his complexity, which is nothing more than a disquieting complexity of ourselves, we are diminished and we perish. Only within this web of ambiguity, paradox, this hunger, danger, darkness, can we find at once ourselves and the power that will free us from ourselves. It is this power of revelation which is the business of the novelist, this journey towards a more vast reality which must take precedence over all other claims, what is today parroted as his responsibility, which seems to mean that he must make formal declaration that he is involved in and affected by the lives of other people, and to say something improving about this somewhat self-evident fact, is, when he believes it, his corruption and our loss. Moreover, it is rooted in, interlocked with, and intensifies the same mechanization. Both Gentleman's Agreement and The Postman Always Rings Twice exemplify this terror of the human being, the determination to cut him down to size. And in Uncle Tom's Cabin, we may find foreshadowing of both. The formula created by the necessity to find a lie more palatable than the truth has been handed down and memorized and persists, yet with a terrible power. It is interesting to consider one more aspect of Mrs. Stowe's novel. The method she used to solve the problem of writing about a Black man at all. Apart from her lively procession of field hands, house niggers, Chloe, Topsy, etc., who are stock, lovable figures presenting no problem, she has only 3 other Negroes in the book. These are the important ones, and 2 of them may be dismissed immediately, since we have only the author's word that they are Negro, and they are, in all other respects, as white as she can make them. These 2 are George and Eliza, a married couple with a wholly adorable child, whose quaintness, incidentally, and whose charm, rather put one in the mind of a darky bootblack doing a buck and wing to the clatter of condescending coins. Eliza is a beautiful, pious hybrid, light enough to pass. The heroine of quality might, indeed, be her reincarnation, differing from the genteel mistress who has overseered her education only in the respect that she is a servant. George is darker, but makes up for it by being a mechanical genius, and is, moreover, sufficiently un-Negroid to pass through town, a fugitive from his master, disguised as a Spanish gentleman, attracting no attention whatsoever beyond admiration. They are a race apart from Topsy. It transpires by the end of the novel, through one of those energetic last-minute convolutions of the plot, that Eliza has some connection with French gentility. The figure from whom the novel takes its name, Uncle Tom, who is a figure of controversy yet, is jet black, woolly-haired, illiterate, and he is phenomenally forbearing. He has to be. He is Black. Only through this forbearance can he survive or triumph. His triumph is metaphysical, unearthly, since he is Black, born without the light. It is only through humility, the incessant mortifications of the flesh, that he can enter into communion with God or man. The virtuous rage of Mrs. Stowe is motivated by nothing so temporal as a concern for the relationship of men to one another, or, even as she would have claimed, by a concern for their relationship to God, but merely by a panic of being hurled into the flames, of being caught in traffic with the devil. She embraced this merciless doctrine with all her heart, bargaining shamelessly before the throne of grace, God and salvation becoming her personal property, purchased with the coin of her virtue. Here, Black equates with evil and white with grace. If, being mindful of the necessities of good works, she could not cast out the Blacks, a wretched, huddled mass apparently claiming, like an obsession, her inner eye, she could not embrace them either without purifying them of sin. She must cover their intimidating nakedness, robed in white, the garments of salvation. Only thus could she herself be delivered from ever-present sin. Only thus could she bury, as St. Paul demanded, the carnal man, the man of flesh. Tom, therefore, her only Black man, has been robbed of his humanity and divested of his sex. It is the price for that darkness with which he has been branded. Uncle Tom's Cabin, then, is activated by what might be called a theological terror, the terror of damnation. And the spirit that breathes in this book, hot, self-righteous, fearful, is not different from that spirit of medieval times which sought to exercise evil by burning witches, and is not different from that terror which activates a lynch mob. One need not, indeed, search for examples so historic or so gaudy. This is a warfare waged daily in the heart, a warfare so vast, so relentless, and so powerful that the interracial handshake or the interracial marriage can be as crucifying as the public hanging or the secret rape. This panic motivates our cruelty. This fear of the dark makes it impossible that our lives shall be other than superficial. This interlocks with and feeding our glittering, mechanical, inescapable civilization, which has put to death our freedom. This, notwithstanding that the avowed aim of the American protest novel is to bring greater freedom to the oppressed, they are forgiven on the strength of these good intentions. Whatever violence they do to language, whatever excessive demands they make of credibility, it is indeed considered the sign of a frivolity so intense as to approach the decadence to suggest that these books are both badly written and widely improbable. One is told to put first things first, the good of society coming before the niceties of style or characterization. Even if this were incontestable, for what exactly is the good of society? It argues an insuperable confusion, since literature and sociology are not one and the same. It is impossible to discuss them as if they were. Our passion for categorization, life neatly fitted into pegs, has led to an unforeseen, paradoxical distress. Confusion, a breakdown of meaning. Those categories which were meant to define and control the world for us have boomeranged us into chaos, in which limbo we whirl, clutching the straws of our definitions. The protest novel, so far from being disturbing, is an accepted and comforting aspect of the American scene, ramifying that framework we believe to be so necessary. Whatever unsettling questions are raised are evanescent, titillating, remote, for this has nothing to do with us. It is safely ensconced in the social arena, where, indeed, it has nothing to do with anyone. So that finally we receive a very definite thrill of virtue from the fact that we are reading such a book at all. This report from the pit reassures us of its reality and its darkness and of our own salvation. And as long as such books are being published, an American liberal once said to me, everything will be all right. But unless one's ideal of society is a race of neatly analyzed, hard-working ciphers, one can hardly claim for the protest novels the lofty purpose they claim for themselves, or share the present optimism concerning them. They emerge for what they are, a mirror of our confusion, dishonesty, panic, trapped and immobilized in the sunlit prison of the American dream. They are fantasies, connecting nowhere with reality, sentimental, in exactly the same sense that such movies as The Best Years of Our Lives or the works of Mr. James M. Cain are fantasies. Beneath the dazzling pyrotechnics of these current operas, one may still discern, as the controlling force, the intense theological preoccupation of Mrs. Stowe, the sick vacuities of the Rover's Boys. Finally, the aim of the protest novel becomes something very closely resembling the zeal of those Alabaster missionaries to Africa, to cover the nakedness of the natives, to hurry them into the pallid arms of Jesus, and thence into slavery. The aim has now become to reduce all Americans to the compulsive, bloodless dimensions of a guy named Joe. It is the peculiar triumph of society and its loss that it is able to convince those people to whom it has given inferior status of the reality of this decree. It has the force and the weapons to translate its dictum into fact, so that the allegedly inferior are actually made so, insofar as the societal realities are concerned. This is a more hidden phenomenon now than it was in the days of serfdom, but it is no less implacable. Now, as then, we find ourselves bound, first without, then within, by the nature of our categorization. And escape is not effected through a bitter railing against this trap. It is as though this very striving were the only motion needed to spring the trap upon us. We take our shape, it is true, within and against that cage of reality bequeathed us at our birth. And yet it is precisely through our dependence on this reality that we are most endlessly betrayed. Society is held together by our need. We bind it together with legend, myth, or origin, fearing that without it, we will be hurled into that void within which, like the earth before the word was spoken, the foundations of society are hidden. From this void, ourselves, it is the function of society to protect us. But it is only this void, our unknown selves, demanding forever a new act of creation, which can save us from the evil that is in the world. With the same motion, at the same time, it is this towards which we endlessly struggle and from which endlessly we struggle to escape. It must be remembered that the oppressed and the oppressor are bound together within the same society. They accept the same criteria. They share the same beliefs. They both alike depend on the same reality. Within this cage, it is romantic, more meaningless, to speak of a new society as the desire of the oppressed, for that shivering dependence on the props of reality which he shares with the herringbone makes a truly new society impossible to conceive. What is meant by a new society is one in which inequalities will disappear, in which vengeance will be exacted. Either there will be no oppressed at all, or the oppressed and the oppressor will change places. But finally, as it seems to me, what the rejected desire is an elevation of status, acceptance within the present community. Thus, the African, exile, pagan, hurried off the auction block and into the fields, fell on his knees before that God in whom he must now believe, who had made him, but not in his image. This tableau, this impossibility, is the heritage of the Negro in America. Wash me, cried the slave to his maker, and I shall be whiter, whiter than snow. For black is the color of evil. Only the robes of the saved are white. It is this cry, implacable on the air and in the skull, that he must live with. Beneath the widely published catalog of brutality, bringing to mind somehow an image, a memory of church bells burdening the air, is the reality which, in the same nightmare notion, he both flees and rushes to embrace. In America, now, this country devoted to the death of the paradox, which may, therefore, be put to death by one. His lot is as ambiguous as a tableau by Kafka. To flee or not, to move or not, it is all the same. His doom is written on his forehead. It is carried in his heart. In Native Son, Bigger Thomas stands on a Chicago street corner, watching airplanes flown by white men racing against the sun, and goddamn, he says, the bitterness bubbling up like blood, remembering a million indignities, the terrible, rat-infested house, the humiliation of home relief, the intense, aimless, ugly bickering, hating it. Hatred smolders through these pages like sulfur fire. All of Bigger's life is controlled, defined by his hatred and his fear. And later, his fear drives him to murder and his hatred to rape. He dies, having come through this violence, we are told, for the first time, to a kind of life, having for the first time redeemed his manhood. Below the surface of this novel there lies, as it seems to me, a continuation, a complement of that monstrous legend it was written to destroy. Bigger is Uncle Tom's descendant, flesh of his flesh, so exactly opposite a portrait that, when the books are placed together, it seems that the contemporary Negro novelist and the dead New England woman are locked together in a deadly, timeless battle. The one uttering merciless exhortations, the other shouting curses. And indeed, within this web of lust and fury, black and white can only thrust and counter-thrust, long for each other's slow, exquisite death. Death by torture, acid, knives, and burning. The thrust, the counter-thrust, the longing making the heavier that cloud which blinds and suffocates them both, so that they go down into the pit together. Thus has the cage betrayed us all. This moment, our life, turned to nothing through our terrible attempts to ensure it. For Bigger's tragedy is not that he is cold, or black, or hungry, not even that he is American, black, but that he has accepted a theology that denies him life, that he admits the possibility of his being subhuman and feels constrained, therefore, to battle for his humanity according to those brutal criteria bequeathed him at his birth. But our humanity is our burden, our life. We need not battle for it. We need only to do what is infinitely more difficult, that is, accept it. The failure of the protest novel lies in its rejection of life, the human being, the denial of his beauty, dread, power, and its insistence that it is his categorization alone which is real and which cannot be transcended.